The morning mist clung to the gardens of Ashford Estate like a shroud, wrapping the ancient oaks and manicured hedges in layers of grey that softened every edge and muted every colour, as if the world itself conspired to blur the boundaries between presence and absence. Lady Eleanor Ashford stood at the tall window of the breakfast room, her fingertips resting against the cold glass, watching the fog drift and swirl across grounds she had walked alone for 5 years. The room behind her echoed with emptiness, the long mahogany table set with delicate porcelain that would grow cold untouched, the silver service gleaming in solitary splendour, the chair at the head of the table pushed in with geometric precision because no one had sat there since the servants arranged it at dawn. She had learned not to wait. The Duke of Ashford, her husband in name and law but in no other meaningful sense, had departed before the sun touched the horizon, as he did every morning. His footsteps in the hallway outside her chamber, a distant rhythm that marked time passing without connection. Eleanor knew his patterns as one knows the changing of seasons inevitable, predictable, entirely indifferent to observation. He would not return until long past midnight, when the house had surrendered to darkness, and she had retreated to her rooms where she would not witness his arrival. They existed in the same grand estate, like ghosts occupying different centuries, passing through the same spaces, but never truly inhabiting them together. She had stopped arranging flowers for his study 3 years ago, when she realized he never noticed their presence or absence. She had stopped requesting his company at dinner 2 years before that, after months of polite refusals delivered through his secretary. The household staff moved around their separate existences with practiced discretion, setting 2 places that would never be occupied simultaneously, maintaining rooms that served as museums to a marriage that had never truly begun. Eleanor's reflection in the window glass showed a woman of 27, her dark hair swept back in a simple style, her morning dress a muted blue that seemed to echo the melancholy of the fog outside. She had been 22 when she became the Duchess of Ashford, young enough to harbour hope, old enough to recognize when that hope had proven foolish. Now, as autumn settled over the estate with its whisper of endings and decline, she watched the mist obscure the distant figure of a rider departing through the gates. Her husband, perhaps, though at this distance and through this veil of grey, he was merely a shadow, which seemed somehow fitting. 5 years of invisible coexistence had taught her to find a strange peace in solitude, to build a life in the margins of a marriage that existed only on paper and in the eyes of society. But on mornings like this, when the world seemed suspended between sleep and waking, she felt the weight of all those uncounted hours, all those words unspoken, all that regard never offered, settling upon her shoulders like the morning cold seeping through the glass beneath her fingers. 5 years earlier, the cathedral had been filled with lilies and the murmur of England's finest families, gathered not to witness love's union, but to observe the careful arrangement of power and property that bound the Ashford Duchy to the considerable fortune of Eleanor's late father. She had stood in white silk that felt like armour, her hands trembling inside her gloves as she walked down an aisle lined with strangers, toward a man she had met only twice before, once at a formal dinner, where he spoke perhaps a dozen words to her, and once when he requested her hand through her guardian uncle with all the warmth of a solicitor reviewing contracts. Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, had been 30 years of age then, tall and severe in his bearing, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if she were merely another responsibility to be acknowledged and filed away in the proper compartment of his ordered life. The ceremony had proceeded with flawless precision, each word spoken with appropriate gravity, each gesture executed with aristocratic grace, and when he placed the ring upon her finger, his touch had been so brief and impersonal that she felt more claimed than cherished. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of champagne toasts and polite congratulations, Eleanor smiling until her face ached, while Sebastian stood beside her, accepting well wishes with the same cool courtesy he might extend to a business associate, and when night fell and she found herself alone in the Duchess's chambers, her heart had hammered with a confused mixture of hope and terror at what the evening might bring. He came to her door at midnight, still in his wedding attire though he had loosened his cravat, and the conversation that followed had been brief and devastating in its clarity. "Your Grace," he had said, and the formal address in what should have been their most intimate moment felt like a door closing. "I believe we should establish the terms of our arrangement." This marriage serves necessary purposes for both our families, but I have no intention of pretending it to be something it is not. You will have every comfort, every courtesy, every freedom appropriate to your position. I ask only that you manage the household competently and appear at my side when social obligation demands it. Beyond that, I will not impose upon you, nor do I expect you to impose upon me." She had stood there in her dressing gown, carefully chosen in a moment of foolish optimism, feeling each word land like a stone. "You speak of our marriage as if it were a business contract," she had managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because that is precisely what it is," he had replied, not unkindly but with a finality that left no room for negotiating different terms. And then he had actually bowed to her, as one might to a stranger at a ball, and withdrawn to his own chambers, leaving her to understand that the distance between their rooms would be the nearest they would ever be. The weeks that followed had taught her the full measure of his words. He departed early, returned late, took his meals in his study, and when they encountered each other in the corridors of Ashford Estate, he offered polite nods that acknowledged her presence, while somehow emphasizing her insignificance. She had tried, in those early months, small gestures of connection that now made her cringe to remember asking about his day, requesting his opinion on household matters that did not require it, suggesting they might dine together occasionally. Each attempt met with courteous refusal or simple absence, until she finally understood that his indifference was not temporary adjustment, but permanent condition, and the young woman who had harbored cautious dreams of earning her husband's regard learned instead to live as a duchess in name, a ghost in practice, inhabiting a grand estate where she was neither seen nor sought. Now, standing at the breakfast-room window watching the fog obscure the grounds, Eleanor felt the weight of those 5 years as a physical thing, pressing upon her chest all those mornings of waking alone, all those evenings of dining in solitude, all those nights of lying in her bed knowing he was somewhere in the vast house, but might as well have been on another continent, for all the connection that existed between them. She had accepted this reality because acceptance was survival, because railing against indifference only exhausted the one doing the railing, and because she had finally learned what her husband had known from the beginning. Some marriages were never meant to be more than arrangements, and she had simply been foolish enough to hope otherwise. Eleanor's days had developed a rhythm over the years, not unlike the measured tick of the grandfather clock in the entrance hall, each hour marked, each task completed, each moment passing in orderly progression toward evening, and then night, and then morning again without variation or surprise. She rose at 7, took her breakfast alone while reading correspondence that rarely contained anything of consequence, then met with Mrs. Pemberton in the morning room to review household matters, discussing menus and supplies, and the rotation of linens with a thoroughness that might have seemed excessive, except that these decisions represented the only domain where her choices held weight. Mrs. Pemberton, a woman of middle years with kind eyes and a discretion born of long service, had become something closer to companion than servant, offering quiet sympathy through careful silences and the occasional gentle comment that acknowledged, without explicitly stating, the peculiar sorrow of Eleanor's position. "Your Grace manages the household beautifully," she would say, or "the staff are devoted to you, ma'am." Small assurances that Eleanor's existence mattered to someone, even if not to the one person whose regard she had once foolishly craved. After the morning's consultations, Eleanor would often take the carriage into the village, visiting families who needed assistance, bringing baskets of food and medicine, sitting with the elderly and the ill, listening to their troubles with an attention that felt like relief, because their problems were tangible, solvable in ways her own never could be. The villagers called her the Good Duchess, unaware that her charity sprang less from nobility of character than from desperate need for purpose, for human connection, for proof that her presence in the world created some small difference. She returned to the estate by midday, took a light lunch in the garden when weather permitted, or in the small parlour when it did not, then retreated to the library where she lost herself in novels and poetry, in the works of philosophers and the journals of travellers who had seen places she would never visit, living vicariously through words because actual living seemed foreclosed to her. The library had become her sanctuary, its tall windows overlooking the rose garden, its shelves holding thousands of volumes that the Duke never touched but which she had read systematically, and working through literature and history and science with the dedication of a scholar, because learning was armor against emptiness, because a mind occupied with ideas could sometimes forget, for precious minutes, the ache of a heart unregarded. She dined alone each evening at the long table, the servants laying out multiple courses that she barely touched, the ritual of formal dining maintained even in solitude, because to abandon it would be to acknowledge defeat, and when the meal concluded she would return to the library or to her chambers, occasionally encountering the Duke in the hallways during his brief passage from front door to study or study to his own rooms, these moments of proximity, somehow emphasizing distance, as he would nod a bare inclination of his head that acknowledged her presence, the way one might acknowledge a piece of furniture, familiar and unremarkable, and continue past without slowing, without speaking, without the slightest indication that the woman he passed was his wife, bound to him by law and vow, and the complete absence of everything those bonds were meant to represent. On this particular evening, in late autumn, as Eleanor made her way toward the library with a book of Wordsworth's poetry tucked under her arm, seeking solace in verses about solitude transfigured into wisdom, she encountered Sebastian in the corridor outside his study, and the moment unfolded with the awful predictability of a play performed countless times. His emergence from the doorway, her instinctive pause, his glance that somehow managed to look at her without seeing her, the slight nod, his continued movement toward the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading, and she standing there in the dimness of the corridor, clutching her book, and feeling the loneliness settle over her like the darkness gathering beyond the windows, thick and suffocating and utterly familiar. Sebastian Ashford maintained his distance from his wife, with the same meticulous precision he applied to every aspect of his life, rising each morning at 5 to review estate correspondence in solitude, and departing for his London offices or parliamentary obligations before the household stirred, returning only after the dinner hour had passed, and Eleanor would have retired to her own pursuits. This careful choreography designed to minimize the chances of encounter, and therefore the risk of connection, because connection led to vulnerability, and vulnerability to the kind of consuming passion that had destroyed his parents as thoroughly as any plague. He had been 17 when he watched his mother waste away from heartbreak after his father's death, had seen how love could transform a rational woman into a hollow-eyed ghost who refused food and company, who spent her days in his father's study touching his belongings as if they were holy relics, who eventually took her own life because existence without the object of her obsessive devotion had become unbearable. And Sebastian had stood at her grave beside his father's and vowed never to allow such dangerous emotion to take root in his own heart, understanding even then that the safest marriage was one built on duty rather than desire, on respect rather than the treacherous ground of affection. When his advisers had suggested the alliance with Eleanor's family, he had accepted precisely because he felt nothing for the pale, quiet girl he met over formal dinners, could look at her composed face and feel only the cool assessment one might direct toward a painting, being considered for purchase, pleasant enough to look upon, unlikely to cause disruption, suitable for the purpose required. He told himself that his indifference was a kindness to them both, that by maintaining emotional distance he protected her from the possibility of becoming what his mother had been, dependent and desperate and ultimately destroyed, though he did not examine too closely whether this logic served her protection or merely his own comfort, his own determination never to feel what his father must have felt watching his wife's decline. The helpless guilt of knowing one's very existence had become another person's entire reason for living. Yet Sebastian was not as oblivious to Eleanor's presence as she believed, had in fact developed a peripheral awareness of her movements through the house, knew, without quite admitting, he knew that she took her breakfast at 8 and her tea at 4, that she walked in the gardens on clear mornings and retreated to the library when it rained, that she wore grey and pale blue most often, that her step in the corridor was light and hesitant, as if she moved through her own home like an apologetic guest, and sometimes when he passed her in those brief, terrible encounters, he would catch the scent of lavender she favored and feel something twist in his chest that he quickly suppressed, telling himself it was merely discomfort at the awkwardness of their arrangement, nothing more significant than that. He had perfected the art of looking at her without seeing her, of nodding acknowledgement while his mind was already moving past to the next matter, requiring attention, but there were moments, though he would not have admitted this even to himself, when he found his gaze drawn to her figure in the garden as he stood at his study window, watching the way she paused to examine roses or speak with the gardener, the way sunlight caught in her dark hair. And he would experience something uncomfortably close to curiosity about what thoughts occupied her mind and what dreams she harbored, before he turned away and buried himself in ledgers and correspondence, in the safe, quantifiable world of business and duty, where emotions could not intrude and destroy, maintaining the careful distance that was, he told himself, the greatest kindness he could offer her. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in early November, delivered with the usual post and distinguished only by the heavy cream paper and the Montrose family crest pressed into crimson wax, and Eleanor nearly set it aside with the other social correspondence she routinely declined, until Mrs. Pemberton, sorting through the morning's delivery with her, made a small sound of interest and said, "The Montrose Ball, Your Grace, it's considered the event of the season. I understand," her tone carefully neutral but her eyes holding a question, perhaps even a hope. Eleanor turned the invitation over in her hands, feeling the weight of expensive stationery, reading the elegant script that requested the honor of the Duke and Duchess of Ashford's presence at an evening of dancing and celebration 3 weeks hence, and felt something stir in her chest that might have been longing or might have been fear, the two emotions so intertwined after years of careful isolation that she could no longer distinguish between them. She had not attended a social gathering since the first year of her marriage, when the pitying glances and carefully averted conversations about the Duke's conspicuous absence from her side had become unbearable, when she had realized that being seen in society only emphasized her invisibility within her own home, and she had retreated into the safety of solitude, where at least her loneliness was private, rather than publicly displayed for the entertainment of the ton. But something in Mrs. Pemberton's expression, something in the very fact that she was 25 years old and had spent the last 4 years seeing no one beyond servants and villagers, something in the desperate hunger for conversation and music and the simple presence of other human beings engaged in the ordinary pleasures of life, made her hesitate rather than immediately penning a polite refusal. "They will talk," Eleanor said quietly, not looking at the housekeeper but at the invitation in her hands, "about the Duke and me, about our arrangement. They will wonder why I come alone, or why we maintain such distance, even in public." Voicing aloud the fears that made her want to tear the invitation in half and return to the safe predictability of her library and her gardens, and her systematic avoidance of anything that might remind her of all she did not have. Mrs. Pemberton was silent for a moment, then said with unusual directness, "Forgive me, Your Grace, but they already talk, and your absence from society only fuels speculation, whereas your presence might remind them that you are a person of consequence, regardless of your husband's attentions." And Eleanor felt the truth of this like a physical blow. The realization that her careful withdrawal had protected nothing, had only confirmed the gossip and transformed her into an object of pity rather than a woman of dignity. She thought of the years stretching ahead, identical to the years behind, each day a repetition of the last, until she was old and grey and could look back on a life spent waiting for a regard that would never come, and the prospect filled her with something close to panic, a desperate need to prove that she still existed beyond these walls, that she was more than the ghost she had become in her own home. "I shall attend," Eleanor said, her voice firmer than she felt, and saw surprise and approval flicker across Mrs. Pemberton's face before the housekeeper nodded and said, "You'll need a new gown, ma'am, something worthy of the occasion." And Eleanor, feeling reckless and terrified, and somehow more alive than she had in years, agreed, deciding in that moment that if she was to step back into the world she had abandoned, she would do so not as the pale, apologetic creature she had become, but as someone who remembered, however dimly, what it meant to be seen. The weeks that followed Eleanor's decision passed with an anticipation she had not felt in so long that the sensation itself seemed foreign, each morning bringing her closer to an evening that had taken on significance far beyond a mere social gathering, representing as it did her first deliberate step back into a world she had abandoned, her first assertion that she existed as something more than a shadow moving through empty corridors. The dressmaker came to Ashford Estate 3 times for fittings, a cheerful woman from the village who seemed to understand without being told that this gown meant something, that it needed to be more than merely acceptable, and together they chose a deep emerald silk that caught the light like water. The color so rich and alive that Eleanor felt almost guilty selecting it after years of grey and pale blue, as if she had no right to such vibrancy. But the dressmaker insisted it brought out the green in her eyes and made her skin luminous rather than pale, transforming what Eleanor had learned to see as washed-out fragility into something that might be called delicate beauty. Each fitting became a small ritual of reclamation, the dressmaker's skilled hands shaping fabric to Eleanor's frame, the bodice fitted to emphasize a figure Eleanor had forgotten she possessed, in the neckline lower than anything she had worn since her wedding, the sleeves designed to fall gracefully from her shoulders in a style that was both modest and somehow daring. And as Eleanor stood before the mirror watching the gown take shape, she felt as if she were witnessing her own resurrection, the woman in the glass, gradually becoming someone she half recognized from years ago, before loneliness had taught her to make herself small and unobtrusive. The night of the ball arrived with the cold clarity of late November, frost-etching patterns on the windows and stars sharp as diamonds in the black sky, and Eleanor began her preparations hours before necessary, needing the time to gather her courage along with her composure, letting her maid arrange her dark hair in an elegant style that left her neck exposed, fastening pearl earrings that had been her mother's, applying the faintest hint of color to her lips and cheeks. When she finally stepped into the emerald gown, and the maid fastened the long row of buttons up her back, when she turned to face her reflection in the full-length mirror, Eleanor felt her breath catch at the stranger looking back at her, a woman whose eyes held both uncertainty and determination, whose shoulders were straight rather than hunched in apologetic withdrawal, whose face showed not the blank composure of someone who had learned not to feel, but the nervous hope of someone daring to want something again. She descended the main staircase with her heart beating too fast, one gloved hand on the banister, and did not see Sebastian emerge from his study until she was halfway down, did not realize he was watching until some instinct made her glance up and find him frozen in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on her, with an intensity she had never seen, directed her way. And for a moment, neither moved, Eleanor suspended on the stairs in her green gown, like a portrait of someone she used to be. Sebastian staring as if seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her, and something passed between them in that silence, recognition perhaps, or shock, or the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask, before Eleanor continued her descent, and Sebastian retreated into his study without a word, and they departed for the ball in separate carriages, as they did everything else, the distance between them maintained even as something new and fragile as frost began forming in the space where indifference used to be. The Montrose estate blazed with light against the November darkness, every window golden and welcoming, and as Eleanor's carriage joined the procession of vehicles, depositing elegantly dressed guests at the entrance, she felt her carefully gathered courage begin to fray, the reality of what she was attempting suddenly overwhelming in its enormity, after years of self-imposed isolation that had made society itself feel like a foreign country whose customs she had forgotten. The footman handed her down and she ascended the wide marble steps alone, her emerald gown a bright declaration against the blacks and whites and pale pastels of the other arriving guests, and she was acutely conscious of eyes turning toward her, of whispered conversations behind fans and gloved hands, of being observed and assessed and no doubt speculated about, the absent Duke's neglected wife making a rare appearance without her husband's escort. The entrance hall was a sensory assault after the quiet of Ashford Estate, all noise and movement and brilliance, chandeliers dripping crystal light, in mirrors multiplying the crowd until it seemed there were hundreds present rather than dozens, musicians tuning instruments in the ballroom beyond, and the sheer volume of human voices laughing, greeting, conversing made Eleanor's head spin after so long, hearing only Mrs. Pemberton's gentle tones and the occasional words of village women accepting her charity. She felt exposed and uncertain, her earlier confidence evaporating in the face of so much life and color and connection, and she was considering retreat, inventing some excuse about feeling unwell, when a voice beside her said, "Forgive my boldness, but you appear as overwhelmed by all this as I feel, and I thought perhaps we might be overwhelmed together rather than separately." And she turned to find a gentleman regarding her with kind grey eyes and an expression of such genuine friendliness that her instinctive withdrawal hesitated. He was perhaps 30 years of age, tall and well-formed, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and a face that suggested intelligence and humor rather than conventional handsomeness. And he bowed with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin and said, "Lord James Hartley, lately of Yorkshire, and presently wishing I had stayed there, as I'm hopeless at these affairs and know almost no one, which makes me either the worst or the best person to offer you company, depending on your tolerance for awkward conversation." Eleanor found herself almost smiling despite her nervousness, something in his self-deprecating manner putting her at ease, and she curtsied, saying, "Eleanor Ashford, your grace, rather, I mean your lordship. I'm the one making conversation awkward already," and was surprised when he laughed, not unkindly but with real amusement, and replied, "Then we're well matched in our ineptitude, your grace, and might I request the honor of this dance so we can be awkward in motion rather than standing here being awkward stationary?" She hesitated, glancing around for Sebastian, though she knew he would not be near. It would be somewhere on the periphery, maintaining his careful distance as always. And when she looked back at Lord Hartley, she saw only patience and kindness in his expression, no pity or calculation or anything, but a simple human offer of companionship, and she found herself nodding, accepting his offered arm, letting him lead her toward the ballroom where couples were forming sets for a country dance, feeling for the first time in 5 years the extraordinary sensation of being seen and of being spoken to as if her responses mattered, of existing in someone's awareness as more than an inconvenient obligation. Across the room, half hidden behind a pillar near the card room, Sebastian watched his wife place her hand on another man's arm, watched her enter the dance floor with an ease she had never shown with him, and told himself firmly that the tightness in his chest was merely the consequence of too much wine on an empty stomach. Nothing more significant than that, nothing that required examination or acknowledgement, certainly not the first stirrings of something that might be called jealousy or regret. The country dance brought them together and apart in the prescribed patterns, hands meeting and releasing, Eleanor moving through the familiar steps with a grace she had not realized she still possessed, and when the movements allowed conversation, Lord Hartley said, "You dance beautifully, your grace," with the ease of someone who has done this since childhood, and Eleanor found herself responding without the careful guardedness that had become her constant companion, saying, "My mother insisted I learn properly. Though I confess I haven't danced in so long I feared I'd forgotten entirely, but apparently the body remembers what the mind thinks lost." The dance separated them briefly, then brought them back together, and Hartley continued as if there had been no interruption. "I find that true of many things we believe ourselves diminished by time and disuse, but touch the right circumstance, and we discover we've merely been waiting rather than withering." And there was something in the way he spoke, a philosophical thoughtfulness that suggested he was someone who actually considered ideas rather than merely repeating fashionable opinions, that made Eleanor venture, "You speak like someone who reads more than society pages," and his smile transformed his entire face into something warm and genuine as he replied, "Guilty as charged, I'm afraid I'm far more comfortable with poetry than politics, much to my steward's despair, and I suspect I bore everyone terribly with my enthusiasm for Wordsworth and Coleridge and all those lake poets my friends consider hopelessly rustic." Eleanor felt something light and forgotten stir in her chest, an excitement she had not experienced since her university-educated governess had first introduced her to serious literature years ago, before marriage had made such pursuits seem irrelevant to her reduced existence, and she said with an animation that surprised her, "But Wordsworth isn't rustic at all. Or rather, he is but deliberately so, finding in nature what society obscures, that inward eye which is the bliss of solitude, the ability to find transcendence in ordinary moments." And Hartley's expression shifted to delighted surprise as he said, "You know daffodils, but of course you do. Forgive me. I've grown so accustomed to blank stares when I mention poetry that actual recognition feels remarkable. Do you read widely then?" The dance continued around them, but Eleanor barely noticed the other couples, conscious only of this conversation, this connection, this extraordinary experience of being heard and responded to as if her thoughts had value. And she told him about her library at Ashford Estate, the books she had accumulated over years of solitary reading, her particular love of the Romantic poets, but also her fascination with philosophy, with Locke and Hume, and their questions about consciousness and identity, and Hartley listened with such evident interest that she kept talking, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam, 5 years of unshared thoughts suddenly finding expression. They discussed the nature of memory and whether identity persisted without witness, debated whether Shelley's atheism enhanced or diminished his poetry, argued pleasantly about whether reason or emotion provided truer access to reality, and Hartley made her laugh, actually laugh, the sound startling from her own throat, when he declared that any philosophy that couldn't account for the pleasure of a perfectly baked scone was fundamentally incomplete, and Eleanor heard herself laughing again when she countered that clearly he had never truly suffered, or he wouldn't be so flippant about the comfort of reason in darkness. Across the ballroom, still half concealed by the pillar, Sebastian watched his wife's face transform with laughter, watched her become animated and alive in a way he had never witnessed, watched her engage with this stranger with an ease and joy that made something twist painfully in his chest, and he told himself again that he didn't care, that this was exactly what he had wanted. Eleanor occupied and content with her own life separate from his, but his hands gripped his wine glass with enough force that his knuckles whitened, and he found he could not look away, could not stop watching this version of Eleanor he had never known existed, vibrant and laughing and absolutely beautiful in her emerald gown, and for the first time in 5 years, Sebastian felt the carefully constructed indifference that had governed his marriage begin to crack under the weight of something he refused to name. The country dance concluded with a final turn and bow, and as the musicians paused to prepare the next set, Eleanor found herself breathless, not from exertion, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of sustained human connection and of being listened to and responded to as if her thoughts held weight and interest. And when Lord Hartley offered his arm to escort her from the floor, she accepted without the hesitation that had governed her earlier movements. Already growing accustomed to this radical notion of companionship, he guided her toward the refreshment room, speaking of a particular translation of Dante he had recently acquired, asking if she had read the Inferno and what she had made of its conception of divine justice. And Eleanor was formulating a response about the difference between justice and vengeance, when they encountered an elegant woman of perhaps 25 years, who shared Hartley's grey eyes and intelligent expression, and he said with evident affection, "Eleanor, forgive me. Your Grace, may I present my sister, Lady Catherine Hartley, who has been attempting to civilize me since childhood with limited success," and Catherine curtsied with a warmth that suggested genuine friendliness rather than mere formality, saying, "My brother has spoken of nothing but poetry and philosophy since returning from your dance. Your Grace," which means you've either humored his obsessions magnificently or actually share them, and I'm hoping desperately for the latter, as it would be delightful to have someone who might discuss ideas rather than merely fashion and gossip. Eleanor found herself drawn to Catherine's directness, so different from the careful social maneuvering she remembered from her brief season before marriage, and they fell into easy conversation about books and ideas while Hartley procured refreshments, returning with champagne and small delicate pastries that Eleanor accepted gratefully, suddenly aware that she had been too nervous to eat before leaving Ashford Estate. The three of them stood together in companionable conversation, Catherine mentioning that she and James were visiting from Yorkshire for the season, that they found London exhausting but occasionally necessary, that she longed to return to their estate, where she could ride and read without society's constant observation. And Eleanor felt a kinship with this woman who seemed to value substance over superficiality, who spoke her mind without artifice or calculation. As the musicians began tuning for the next set, Hartley turned to Eleanor with an expression that was both hopeful and slightly hesitant, and he said, "Your Grace, I wonder if I might presume upon your kindness. Would you consent to another dance, or have I monopolized your evening too thoroughly already?" Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of conflicting desires, the pleasure of being wanted for her company, warring with the ingrained sense that she should not draw attention and should not give society further cause to speculate about the absent Duke's neglected wife. But when she glanced toward where she had last seen Sebastian lurking by the pillar, he was no longer there, vanished as he always did, and she thought with a flash of something that might have been defiance or despair that 5 years of invisibility had earned her at least one evening of visibility, one night of existing in someone's awareness as more than an inconvenience or obligation. She was about to accept when Hartley continued, his voice dropping slightly, as if to offer privacy despite the crowded room. "And I hope this is not too forward, Your Grace, but I wonder if I might call upon you at Ashford Estate. I leave for Yorkshire in a fortnight, and I confess I would very much enjoy continuing our conversation about Wordsworth's conception of memory and identity, if you would permit such a visit." And Eleanor felt her breath catch, because this was different from a dance. This was acknowledgement that he wanted more than a single evening's acquaintance, that he found value enough in her company to pursue it deliberately. Her mind raced through implications and proprieties, acutely aware that she was married even if that marriage existed only on paper, that accepting calls from an unmarried gentleman might cross some invisible line she had not yet articulated. But Hartley seemed to read her hesitation, because he added quickly, "I should clarify. I seek only friendship and conversation. Your Grace, I would never presume anything inappropriate given your circumstances, but I have so rarely found someone who engages with ideas as you do, and Catherine would accompany me as chaperone. It would all be entirely proper, merely an opportunity to discuss literature and philosophy over tea rather than shouting over ballroom music." And there was such earnest hopefulness in his expression, such genuine interest in her thoughts rather than any calculated seduction, that Eleanor found herself nodding, saying, yes, she would welcome such a visit, that she too had rarely found opportunities for substantive conversation and would value the chance to continue their discussion. Hartley's face transformed with pleasure, and he bowed deeply, saying, "You have made this tedious ball entirely worthwhile, Your Grace. I shall call Tuesday next if that suits." And Eleanor agreed, feeling something like anticipation bloom in her chest, something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten the sensation, and as Hartley led her back onto the floor for their second dance, she did not see Sebastian emerge from the card-room where he had retreated, did not notice how his hands gripped his wine-glass with such force that the delicate crystal stem cracked beneath his fingers, did not observe how his carefully cultivated indifference had given way to something raw and painful that he refused to examine too closely, knowing only that watching Eleanor accept another man's attentions, watching her smile and laugh and agree to future meetings with an ease she had never shown him, felt like drowning in a sea of his own making, every wave carrying the weight of 5 years of deliberate distance that suddenly seemed less like protection and more like the greatest mistake of his carefully controlled life. The evening had deepened into that peculiar hour when champagne and candlelight conspire to make everything seem more vivid and possible, when Eleanor found herself once again approaching the dance floor on Lord Hartley's arm, the third time he had requested her company, and the third time she had accepted without the hesitation that had marked her earlier decisions. And as they took their positions for the waltz, that still scandalous dance that required actual proximity between partners, she felt acutely conscious of the eyes upon them, of the whispers that surely speculated about the Duke's long-neglected wife and this attentive northern earl. But for once she found she did not care about society's observations, found instead that she was simply grateful to be seen, to exist in someone's awareness as something more than a ghost haunting her own life. Hartley smiled down at her as the music began, that warm, genuine expression that seemed incapable of artifice or calculation. And as they moved into the first turn, Eleanor felt something light and free unfurl in her chest. Some part of herself she had locked away for 5 years of survival suddenly permitted to emerge, and when the dance required her to step back and curtsy before they rejoined that formal acknowledgement of mutual respect and regard that the waltz demanded, she sank into the gesture with a grace that came from years of training, but also from genuine appreciation, genuine recognition that this man saw her and valued what he saw, and as she rose from the curtsy and met Hartley's eyes, she saw reflected there the same warm regard, the same acknowledgement of her worth, and he bowed to her with a depth that suggested reverence rather than mere formality, and for one crystalline moment Eleanor felt wholly present in her own existence, wholly visible, wholly valued. Across the ballroom, Sebastian had emerged from his self-imposed exile in the card-room, drawn by some instinct he could not name and did not want to examine, and he stood partially concealed by the heavy velvet drapes that framed the tall windows, watching as his wife, whom he had not touched in 5 years, had not spoken to beyond necessary pleasantries, had not looked at directly for fear of what he might feel, curtsied to another man, with a grace and warmth she had never shown him, watched as Hartley bowed to her with obvious respect and admiration, watched as something passed between them that looked remarkably like mutual recognition, like the foundation of genuine regard, and Sebastian felt something crack deep in his chest, felt it like a physical rupture, like the breaking of ice that had formed over years of deliberate freezing. And suddenly the ballroom tilted sideways, the chandelier's 1,000 candles blurring into streaks of painful light, his breath coming short and sharp as if someone had laced his ribs too tightly, his vision narrowing to a tunnel that showed only Eleanor's face, radiant and alive in Hartley's presence, in a way she had never been in his. The floor rushed up to meet him, or perhaps he rushed down to meet it. Sebastian could not tell which, aware only of the sudden absence of his own control, the betrayal of his carefully disciplined body, the horrible public spectacle of the Duke of Ashford collapsing in the middle of the Montrose ballroom, and he heard screams, felt hands grasping at him, saw faces swimming above him in concern and barely concealed delight at the scandal. But the only face that came into clear focus was Eleanor's, suddenly there beside him, her cool hands on his face, her voice sharp with command, as she ordered someone to fetch water, someone else to give them space, her emerald gown pooling around her as she knelt on the floor without regard for propriety or her expensive silk. And Sebastian felt her fingers on his throat, checking his pulse, felt her other hand steady against his chest, and realized with a shock that cut through even his physical distress that this was the first time she had touched him in 5 years, and the first time since their wedding night, when he had set the terms of their arrangement, and she had accepted with devastated dignity, and now here she was touching him with professional efficiency, but also with something that might have been concern, might even have been care, and Sebastian did not know whether to be grateful or ashamed that it had taken his collapse, had taken the weight of 5 years of waste and regret, literally bringing him to his knees to finally bridge the distance he had so carefully constructed between them. Sebastian regained his composure with the stubborn pride that had governed his entire life, pushing himself upright despite the hands that tried to restrain him, insisting through clenched teeth that he was perfectly well, that the room had simply been overheated, that everyone should return to their enjoyment and forget this foolish spectacle. But Lord Montrose would not hear of such protestations and insisted that Sebastian rest in one of the guest chambers until he was truly recovered. And Eleanor found herself supporting her husband's weight as he was escorted from the ballroom, acutely aware of every eye upon them, of the scandal this would generate, of how the ton would feast upon this scene for weeks to come. The absent Duke collapsing at the exact moment, his neglected wife showed interest in another man, but such concerns felt distant and unimportant compared to the alarming pallor of Sebastian's face, the tremor in his hands that he could not quite disguise, the way his breathing remained shallow and irregular, despite his claims of wellness. Hartley materialized beside them with admirable discretion, offering his assistance in a low voice that suggested he understood both the gravity of the situation and the delicacy required. But Eleanor saw something pass between the two men, some masculine communication that resulted in Hartley stepping back with a small bow and a murmured, "I shall call another time, Your Grace," directed at Eleanor with such understanding and lack of presumption that she felt a flash of gratitude for his graceful retreat, his recognition that whatever else this evening had been, her husband required her attention now, and Hartley's continued presence would only complicate matters. The carriage ride back to Ashford Estate passed in tense silence. Sebastian slumped against the velvet cushions with his eyes closed. Eleanor perched on the opposite seat with her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from reaching out to check his pulse again, to smooth the hair back from his damp forehead, to offer comfort. She had no right to give, and he had never wanted to receive. But every few moments her gaze would flicker to his face, searching for signs of further distress, cataloguing the harsh lines of pain around his mouth, the unusual vulnerability in his posture, and when the carriage hit a particularly rough patch of road, and Sebastian's eyes opened briefly, she found herself saying, "The physician should examine you," her voice coming out sharper than intended, edged with a concern she could not quite suppress, and Sebastian responded with something between a laugh and a groan, saying, "I hardly think that necessary. It was merely a momentary weakness, nothing more." But Eleanor heard the uncertainty beneath his dismissal, heard the confusion of a man whose body had betrayed the rigid control he maintained over every aspect of his existence. When they arrived at Ashford Estate, Eleanor descended first and found herself offering her hand to assist him from the carriage, a reversal of every propriety they had observed for 5 years, and Sebastian stared at her extended hand for a long moment before accepting it, his fingers closing around hers with a warmth that shocked her after so long without touch. And as he stepped down, she felt him lean slightly into her support, felt the weight of him against her side. And something ancient and instinctive rose up in her chest, the desire to care for him, to tend his wounds, despite all the wounds he had inflicted upon her. And she realized, with a mixture of frustration and resignation, that 5 years of neglect had not killed her capacity to feel concern for this man, had not erased the stubborn, foolish hope that somewhere beneath his cold formality existed someone worth caring for. And as she guided him into the house with her hand still clasped in his, she wondered whether this collapse had been the breaking of something essential or the beginning of something entirely unexpected, whether catastrophe might contain within it the seeds of transformation, whether the man who had ignored her existence for 5 years might finally, in his moment of greatest vulnerability, truly see her for the first time. Eleanor insisted that Dr. Whitmore be summoned despite the late hour, her tone brooking no argument as she gave instructions to the household staff, who had assembled in nervous clusters throughout the entrance hall, their eyes wide with concern and poorly concealed curiosity at the unprecedented sight of the Duchess attending to the Duke's welfare. And Sebastian found himself too exhausted to protest as he was escorted to his chambers. Those rooms Eleanor had never entered in all their years of marriage, and settled into a chair while they awaited the physician's arrival, the irony not lost on him that illness had accomplished what proximity never could, had brought his wife into the most private sanctuary of his carefully constructed solitude. Dr. Whitmore arrived within the hour, his examination thorough and professional, his questions probing as he checked Sebastian's heart rate and breathing, peered into his eyes, palpated his abdomen, inquired about his sleeping habits, his eating patterns, the stresses he carried, and Eleanor stood to the side, watching with an intensity that made Sebastian acutely uncomfortable, made him aware of how thoroughly he had neglected the basic requirements of self-preservation in his pursuit of emotional safety through distance and control. The physician's diagnosis came with a gravity that suggested both concern and a certain lack of surprise. Severe exhaustion compounded by chronic stress, irregular meals, insufficient sleep, the accumulated toll of years spent driving himself without respite or care, his body finally demanding what his will had refused to grant. And Dr. Whitmore prescribed complete rest for at least a fortnight, regular meals, proper sleep, a temporary cessation of all business activities, his tone making clear that these were not suggestions, but requirements if Sebastian wished to avoid a more serious collapse. After the physician departed, Eleanor took command with a quiet efficiency that Sebastian found both admirable and deeply unsettling, organizing a schedule for his care, instructing cook to prepare simple, nutritious meals at regular intervals, arranging for his correspondence to be managed by his secretary, transforming his chambers from a place of isolated retreat into something resembling a sick room, and Sebastian wanted to object to this invasion, to reassert his autonomy and send her away, but found himself incapable of mustering the energy or conviction, found instead that some part of him was grateful for her competence, for the way she moved through his space without hesitation or deference, as though she had every right to be there tending to him. That first night Eleanor insisted on remaining in the adjoining dressing room, claiming she needed to monitor his condition in case of further complications, and Sebastian lay in his bed listening to the soft sounds of her movements through the door, the rustle of fabric as she settled into a chair, the quiet turning of pages as she read by lamplight, and he realized with a shock that this domestic intimacy, this simple awareness of another person's presence in his private space, was something he had denied himself for. So long, he had forgotten what it felt like to not be completely alone. He pretended to sleep, but watched through half-closed eyes when she entered periodically to check on him, her face softened by candlelight, her movements gentle as she adjusted his blankets or set a glass of water on the bedside table. And each time she came, Sebastian felt something ancient and carefully constructed crack a little further, felt the walls he had built to protect himself from the destructive passion he had witnessed in his parents begin to crumble under the quiet, persistent pressure of Eleanor's care, her competence in crisis revealing a strength he had never permitted himself to acknowledge. And as the night deepened and she finally settled into reading aloud, her voice low and soothing as she chose some volume of poetry from his shelf, Sebastian found himself listening not to the words but to the cadence of her speech, the warmth beneath her formal tone, and understood with a terrible clarity that he had spent 5 years protecting himself from a woman who deserved his protection. He had created safety through isolation, when true safety might have been found in the very connection he had refused. And as dawn began to lighten the windows, and Eleanor's voice finally stilled, in her breathing evening into sleep in the chair beside his bed, Sebastian watched her sleeping face and felt the full weight of everything he had wasted, everything he had destroyed through his cowardice disguised as wisdom, and knew that whatever came next would require a courage he had never before possessed, the courage to be vulnerable, to need, to allow himself to be seen and cared for by the woman he had so thoroughly failed. 3 days passed with Eleanor maintaining her vigil over Sebastian's recovery, 3 days during which the household adjusted to the unprecedented reality of the Duke and Duchess occupying the same spaces, sharing meals in his chambers, conversing in low tones about matters both trivial and substantial. And it was on the afternoon of the 4th day that Lord Hartley arrived as promised, his card presented by the butler, while Eleanor sat reading to Sebastian from a volume of Wordsworth, and she felt her breath catch at the name on the cream-colored cardstock, felt Sebastian's gaze upon her face as she made her excuses and rose to receive their visitor, smoothing the simple day dress she wore with hands that trembled slightly from an emotion she could not quite name. Sebastian remained in his study per Dr. Whitmore's orders to rest quietly, but he found himself drawn to the window that overlooked the gardens and found himself unable to resist watching as Eleanor emerged onto the terrace with Hartley beside her, the Earl's posture conveying both respect and genuine pleasure at her company, and Sebastian observed how Eleanor's entire bearing transformed in Hartley's presence, how her shoulders relaxed, how gestures that had been confined and cautious for 5 years became animated and expressive, how she smiled, truly smiled, as they descended the stone steps into the autumn garden where chrysanthemums bloomed in defiance of the coming frost. He watched them walk the gravel paths he had traversed 1,000 times alone, watched Eleanor gesture toward the rose arbor where late blooms still clung to thorny branches, watched Hartley lean close to hear something she said and throw back his head in laughter, genuine and unrestrained, and Sebastian felt something twist in his chest that was far more complex than simple jealousy, felt instead a profound understanding of what he had locked away and denied, felt the full weight of Eleanor's isolation reflected back at him through the contrast of her present animation, and understood with terrible clarity that this woman, his wife, bound to him by law and vow, and 5 years of shared emptiness, had been starving for exactly this kind of connection, this simple human warmth of conversation and regard that he had systematically denied her, while convincing himself his indifference was a form of protection. Hartley's conduct remained impeccable throughout the visit, his manner toward Eleanor suggesting the highest respect, never presuming upon familiarity or exploiting the obvious vulnerability of her circumstances, and when they paused beside the fountain where water trickled over moss-covered stone, Sebastian saw Hartley bow formally, as though taking his leave, saw Eleanor's face fall slightly before she composed herself, he saw her curtsy in return, and even from this distance Sebastian could read the gratitude in her expression, could see that Hartley had offered her something precious and rare, the simple gift of being seen, being heard, being treated as a person worthy of attention and care, and Sebastian's hands clenched on the window frame as he recognized that this man, this stranger who had known Eleanor for mere hours across 2 encounters, and had shown her more genuine regard than her own husband had managed in 5 years of marriage. As Hartley departed and Eleanor remained in the garden, her face turned up toward the pale autumn sun with her eyes closed. Sebastian felt his jealousy transform into something far more difficult to bear, felt it transmute into regret so profound it threatened to crush him. Regret for every conversation denied, every smile unseen, every opportunity for connection deliberately destroyed in the service of his fear, and he understood that Eleanor was not some treasure he had kept locked safely away, but a living woman whose light he had systematically extinguished, whose warmth he had frozen through calculated neglect, and watching her standing alone in the garden, beautiful and melancholy, and utterly beyond his reach. Despite the legal bonds that tied them, Sebastian finally comprehended the full magnitude of what he had done, finally understood that his attempt to avoid his parents' destructive passion had created its own form of destruction, and felt rising within him a desperate need to somehow bridge the chasm he had created, though he had no idea whether 5 years of damage could ever be repaired or whether Eleanor would even grant him the opportunity to try. That evening, Sebastian dismissed his valet early and sat alone in his study as darkness gathered beyond the windows, the room illuminated only by the fire crackling in the hearth and a single lamp on his desk, its golden light casting shadows that seemed to dance like ghosts of all the choices he had made and all the moments he had destroyed. And he found himself unable to focus on the estate papers before him, unable to think of anything except Eleanor's face in the garden that afternoon, the way she had looked at Hartley with such openness and trust, the way she had never looked at him in 5 years of marriage. And Sebastian rose from his desk to stand before the fire, staring into the flames as though they might offer some wisdom or absolution for the waste he had created. The memories came unbidden, as they always did when he allowed himself to be still and vulnerable, memories of his childhood at Ashford before it had become this mausoleum of careful distance, memories of his parents whose passion for each other had burned so bright and so destructive that it had consumed them both and nearly destroyed their only son in the conflagration, and Sebastian could still remember his mother's wild laughter turning to wilder tears, could still hear his father's voice raised in fury and then broken with desperate apologies, could still feel the terror of being a child, trapped in a house where love and violence were so intertwined they became indistinguishable, where devotion manifested as possession and tenderness transformed without warning into cruelty. He had been 12 when his mother finally left, fleeing in the night with a lover she claimed offered her the freedom his father's obsessive love denied, and Sebastian had watched his father disintegrate over the following months, watched a man of strength and position reduced to a shell who drank himself into oblivion every night while calling her name, watched as pride and power crumbled before the terrible force of ungoverned passion, and when his father died less than a year later, whether by accident or intention, Sebastian had never been certain. The boy had stood at the grave and made a silent vow that he would never allow himself to become such a creature, would never permit emotion to override reason, would never love so unwisely and so well that it destroyed him. That vow had shaped every decision Sebastian made thereafter, had guided him through his years at university, where he observed his peers falling into infatuations and entanglements with a detached curiosity, had governed his approach to selecting a wife, where he deliberately chose Eleanor, not despite her quiet, gentle nature, but because of it, believing that a woman of such temperament could never inspire the kind of dangerous passion he feared, could never threaten the careful control he had constructed around his heart, and he had congratulated himself on his wisdom even as he implemented the systems of distance that would ensure safety, had believed he was protecting them both from the tragedy that had claimed his parents, had convinced himself that indifference was a form of kindness, that emotional neglect was infinitely preferable to emotional devastation. But standing in his study with the fire casting shifting light across the Persian carpet and the house quiet around him, Sebastian finally understood with a clarity that felt like physical pain that he had been catastrophically wrong, that in protecting himself from one form of destruction he had created another equally profound, that his careful indifference had not prevented tragedy, but had instead inflicted a different kind of suffering on a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. And he saw now that Eleanor's loneliness was his creation, that her isolation was his design, that the 5 years of emptiness that had hollowed out their marriage were the direct result of his cowardice masquerading as wisdom. He thought of how she had looked at Hartley, thought of the animation in her face and the warmth in her voice, thought of how she had curtsied to that man with genuine respect and regard, and Sebastian felt something crack open inside his chest, felt the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself begin to crumble under the weight of understanding what he had wasted, what he had destroyed, what he had prevented from ever existing, and he knew with terrible certainty that he must find a way to speak to Eleanor, must find words to bridge 5 years of silence, must somehow convince her that he was capable of change, even though he had given her no evidence to support such a belief, though he had no idea how to begin such a conversation or whether she would even grant him the opportunity to try. And as the fire burned low and the night deepened around him, Sebastian remained standing in the gathering darkness, confronting at last the man he had become and the far better man he desperately needed to be. Sebastian waited 2 days after Hartley's visit before he could summon the courage to act upon the decision that had crystallized in his study that dark evening. 2 days during which he rehearsed and discarded a dozen different approaches to bridging the chasm he had spent 5 years constructing. And finally, on the morning of the 3rd day, he instructed his valet to inform the Duchess that he requested the honor of her company at dinner that evening. The formality of the request itself, an acknowledgement of how thoroughly he had forfeited any claim to her casual presence. And when the valet returned with Eleanor's carefully neutral acceptance, Sebastian felt his heart accelerate with an anxiety he had not experienced since his university days, an uncomfortable awareness that he was about to attempt something for which his entire adult life had left him catastrophically unprepared. The dining room that evening seemed both too large and too intimate, as Sebastian entered to find Eleanor already seated at what had traditionally been her solitary place at the long mahogany table, and he hesitated in the doorway before crossing to take the chair directly across from her, rather than at the distant head of the table, where hierarchy and custom dictated he should sit. And he saw surprise flicker across her face before she composed herself into the expression of polite neutrality she had perfected over their years of marriage. Her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that suggested careful self-control, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping to study the pattern on her plate with apparent fascination. The first course arrived in a silence broken only by the soft clink of silver against porcelain and the measured footsteps of servants who moved with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to serving meals consumed in solitude, and Sebastian found himself unable to taste the consommé before him, unable to focus on anything except Eleanor's presence across the narrow space of white linen and flickering candlelight, unable to formulate the opening words that might begin to dismantle the wall between them. And it was only when the soup was cleared and the servants had withdrawn that he finally managed to speak, his voice sounding strange and uncertain, even to his own ears, as he asked whether she had enjoyed the fine weather they had been blessed with recently. The banality of the question hanging in the air between them like a confession of his inadequacy. Eleanor's response was everything he deserved and nothing he hoped for, her tone perfectly polite and utterly distant as she confirmed that yes, the weather had indeed been pleasant, and she appreciated the opportunity it provided for her daily walks in the garden, and Sebastian heard in her measured words the echo of 5 years of conversations denied, heard the wall he had built reflected back at him in her careful politeness, and he tried again, asking what books she had been reading, what occupied her thoughts and her days, and she answered each question with the same neutral courtesy, describing her current volume of Austen and her charitable work in the village, with a detachment that made clear she was responding to duty rather than desire, protecting herself behind the same barriers of formality he had taught her were necessary for survival in their marriage. He asked then about Hartley, the question emerging more abruptly than he intended, asked whether the Earl had proven an agreeable acquaintance, and saw something shift in Eleanor's expression, saw her chin lift slightly as she met his gaze with a directness she had not displayed earlier in the meal, and she told him with quiet dignity that Lord Hartley had been kind enough to offer his friendship, that he was a gentleman of culture and conversation, that she found his company refreshing, the final word chosen with deliberate care, and Sebastian understood that she was both answering his question and issuing a challenge, asserting her right to seek elsewhere what he had denied her here, and he felt the truth of his situation settle over him like a weight, as he recognized that he had no grounds to object, no foundation upon which to build a claim to her attention or her regard, no right to ask anything of her except perhaps the opportunity to try to become worthy of what he had squandered. Sebastian attempted then to express something of what he had been feeling, tried to find words for the understanding that had been growing in him since the collapse at the Montrose ball, but his vocabulary, so adequate for estate management and political discourse, proved utterly insufficient for matters of emotion and regret, and his fumbling sentences about having perhaps been too distant, about recognizing that their arrangement might benefit from greater cordiality, fell between them like stones, heavy and graceless, and he saw Eleanor's expression shift from wariness to something that might have been disappointment or perhaps simply resignation, saw her withdraw even further behind her careful composure, and when she rose from the table with a murmured excuse about fatigue and retired before the final course was served. Sebastian remained alone in the dining room with the candles burning low, and the realization that crossing 5 years of silence would require far more than awkward dinners and inadequate words. It would demand a transformation he was not certain he possessed the courage or capability to achieve. The following weeks brought changes to Ashford Estate so subtle that the servants might not have noticed, had they not been accustomed to 5 years of rigid patterns, suddenly disrupted, and Eleanor found herself navigating a landscape transformed not by dramatic gestures, but by the quiet accumulation of small attentions that left her uncertain whether she was witnessing genuine transformation or merely observing a man, attempting to assert ownership over what he feared losing to another. Sebastian began appearing at dinner every evening, no longer sending excuses or remaining sequestered in his study until the household slept, and though their conversations remained stilted and careful, she detected, in his questions about her day and her thoughts, something that resembled actual interest rather than mere politeness, and she responded with cautious civility, and unwilling to expose herself to disappointment, but unable to entirely ignore the effort he was making. He asked her opinion on matters of estate management for the first time in their marriage, inquiring whether she thought the tenant farmers might benefit from new equipment or whether the village school required additional funding, and Eleanor answered honestly while wondering whether he would actually implement her suggestions or whether this was simply performance. And when she discovered weeks later that he had indeed ordered the equipment and increased the school's allowance, she felt something shift inside her chest, as a small crack in the protective wall she had constructed around her wounded heart. She noticed other changes as well, small gestures that accumulated like snowfall, each one individually insignificant, but together creating something that resembled the shape of attention and perhaps even care. A new novel appeared on the table beside her favorite chair in the library, a volume by an author she had mentioned enjoying during one of their careful dinners, and when she opened it she found Sebastian's handwriting on the inside cover, a simple inscription that read only, "For Eleanor," but which represented the first time in 5 years he had acknowledged her preferences or attempted to please her. Flowers began appearing in her chambers, not the formal arrangements that the housekeeper ordered for the public rooms, but smaller, more personal bouquets of the wildflowers she had mentioned preferring during a walk through the estate gardens, and she found cards written in Sebastian's angular script with messages that grew gradually less formal, progressing from "with compliments" to "I thought you might enjoy these" to finally, "these reminded me of you." Eleanor received these attentions with a confusion that kept her awake long into the night, her mind circling endlessly around the question of Sebastian's motivations, wondering whether this transformation stemmed from genuine recognition of what he had destroyed, or whether it was merely the territorial response of a man who had ignored his possession until another showed interest in claiming it. And she thought of Hartley's respectful friendship, of how he had demonstrated in a single evening what regard and consideration looked like, and she found herself unable to accept less than she now understood she deserved, unwilling to settle for gestures that might evaporate as quickly as they had appeared, determined to protect the fragile sense of self-worth that had begun growing in her during those hours at the Montrose ball, when she had remembered what it felt like to be seen and valued as a person rather than endured as an obligation. She continued her walks with Hartley when he called, continued their conversations about literature and philosophy, continued accepting his friendship while carefully maintaining the boundaries appropriate to her married state. And she was aware that Sebastian watched from the windows of his study, was conscious of the tension in his shoulders when she returned from those walks, with color in her cheeks and animation in her voice, but she refused to surrender the one source of genuine human connection she had found, simply to soothe the conscience of a man who had spent 5 years ensuring she had nothing. And so the weeks passed in this strange state of transformation and uncertainty, of small kindnesses offered and carefully received, of a marriage beginning to shift from its foundation of indifference towards something Eleanor could not yet name and did not yet trust, while she guarded her heart and waited to discover whether Sebastian's changed behavior would prove lasting enough to risk believing in, or whether she would once again find herself alone in the vast emptiness of Ashford Estate, this time with the added pain of having hoped for something better. The uncertainty became unbearable on a grey morning in late November when Eleanor woke to find frost coating the windows of her chamber and realized she could no longer endure the careful dance she and Sebastian had been performing for weeks, could no longer bear the weight of not knowing whether his attentions stemmed from genuine transformation or merely from the territorial instinct of a man who had ignored his possession until another threatened to claim it, and she decided with a clarity that surprised her that she would demand the truth regardless of what it might cost her, would insist upon honesty, even if that honesty destroyed the fragile détente they had established, because living in this state of suspended hope was proving more painful than the 5 years of accepted loneliness had ever been. She found Sebastian in his study that afternoon, in the room that had served as his refuge from her existence for their entire marriage, and when she entered without knocking, she saw surprise flash across his face, followed by something that might have been apprehension, and she closed the door behind her with a firmness that made clear she would not be easily dismissed, and she stood before his desk with her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling, and asked the question that had been consuming her thoughts for weeks, asked whether his recent attentions represented genuine change or merely jealous possession, whether he was seeing her at last or simply asserting ownership over what he feared losing. Sebastian rose from his chair, his face pale in the weak afternoon light filtering through the mullioned windows, and Eleanor watched him struggle to find words, saw him open his mouth and close it again, saw in his expression the same inadequacy with emotional articulation that had characterized their awkward dinners, and she felt something inside her begin to crack as she realized he might not be able to give her the answer she needed, might not possess the vocabulary or the courage to name what he was feeling, and she heard her voice break as she told him she could not continue like this, could not accept gestures and attentions without understanding their source, could not risk hoping again, only to discover she had misunderstood everything. He came around the desk then, moved toward her with an urgency she had never seen in him before, and he stopped just beyond arm's length, as though uncertain whether he had the right to close the distance, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with something that sounded like pain, as he told her that watching her curtsy to Hartley at the Montrose ball, watching her receive from another man the regard and respect he had never offered her, had shown him with devastating clarity what he had destroyed, and he confessed that the collapse had not been merely physical weakness, but rather the sudden, unbearable weight of 5 years of waste, 5 years of squandering what had been freely given, 5 years of treating as obligation what should have been treasured as gift. Eleanor felt tears begin to slip down her cheeks as Sebastian continued, his words coming faster now, as though a dam had broken, and he told her of his parents' passionate and toxic love that had ended in tragedy, told her of his terror of repeating their pattern, told her that he had believed indifference was protection, that distance was kindness, that by refusing to love her he was saving them both from destruction, and he had not understood until he saw her with Hartley, that in protecting himself from one kind of tragedy he had created another, had condemned them both to a different form of slow destruction, and had been cruel in what he convinced himself was kindness. She watched him struggle with the confession, saw the effort it cost him to excavate and examine feelings he had spent a lifetime burying, and when he finally fell silent and stood before her with his defenses stripped away, she understood that whatever else this was, it was genuine, that his transformation might be incomplete and uncertain, but it was real, and she wept then for the 5 years they had lost, for the pain they had both endured, for the terrible waste of 2 people living as strangers under the same roof when they might have been companions, might have been friends, might even have been partners if he had possessed the courage to try and she had known enough to demand it. And when Sebastian reached tentatively toward her and she did not pull away, he gathered her into his arms and held her while she cried against his chest, and she felt his tears falling into her hair as he whispered again and again that he was sorry, so terribly sorry, for all the years he had made her invisible when she deserved to be seen, for all the loneliness he had caused when he might have offered companionship, for squandering what he now understood was precious beyond measure, and Eleanor clung to him and wept for what had been lost while simultaneously feeling the first fragile stirring of possibility for what might yet be built from these ruins, if they both possessed the courage to try. Eleanor stepped back from Sebastian's embrace after several long moments, wiping the tears from her cheeks with trembling fingers, and though the confession he had offered carried the weight of genuine emotion, and the pain in his eyes appeared authentic. She found herself unable to simply accept his words and allow 5 years of systematic neglect to dissolve into forgiveness, unable to ignore the truth that weeks of attention and a single vulnerable conversation could not erase the accumulated damage of half a decade spent being treated as invisible, as less than an obligation, as a presence to be avoided rather than a person to be known. And she looked at him standing before her, with his own tears still wet on his face, and spoke with a steadiness that surprised her, given the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. She told him that she believed he was sorry, believed that his realization was genuine, believed that he had indeed spent 5 years operating under a mistaken philosophy, that distance was protection and indifference was kindness. But she could not allow belief in his sincerity to override the fundamental truth that she deserved more than to be suddenly noticed only when another man showed her the regard that should have been hers by right, deserved more than to become visible, only when the possibility of losing her made Sebastian finally see what he had possessed all along. And she watched his face as she explained that Hartley had shown her in the span of a single evening what it meant to be treated with consideration and respect, had demonstrated through simple conversation and genuine interest that she was worthy of attention, worthy of being seen and heard and valued, and she would not accept less than that standard, regardless of how much Sebastian's confession might have moved her, or how genuine his remorse appeared to be. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his expression shifting between pain and understanding, and when Eleanor paused to gather her thoughts, he nodded slowly and told her that she was right, that 5 years of neglect could not be erased by weeks of changed behavior, could not be undone by gestures and gifts and careful dinners, no matter how sincere his intentions might be, and he acknowledged that he had no right to expect her forgiveness or her trust, or even her willingness to give him another opportunity, that he had squandered what was given freely at the beginning of their marriage and could not simply reclaim it, now that he had finally recognized its value. But he asked with a humility she had never heard in his voice whether she might be willing to let him try to earn what he had lost, whether she might grant him the chance to prove through sustained action rather than temporary gesture that his transformation was real and lasting, whether she might allow him to demonstrate over time that he was capable of becoming the husband he should have been from the beginning. Eleanor felt the weight of the decision pressing against her chest as she considered his request, torn between the part of her that wanted desperately to believe in the possibility of redemption and the part that screamed warnings about protecting herself from further disappointment, about guarding the fragile self-worth she had only recently begun to reclaim. And she thought of the 5 years she had already lost, of the loneliness she had endured, of the woman she had become in the silence of Ashford Estate. And she knew that whatever she decided now would shape the rest of her life in ways both profound and irreversible. She told Sebastian that she would give him the opportunity he requested, but that she would keep her emotional distance, would observe his actions rather than trusting his words, would require sustained and consistent demonstration of change before she would risk believing that this transformation represented anything more than temporary adjustment driven by jealousy or wounded pride. And she explained that she would continue her friendship with Hartley, because that connection had been the catalyst for her own awakening, and she would not surrender it to soothe Sebastian's conscience. And if Sebastian could not accept those terms, then there was nothing more to discuss, and they would return to the careful coexistence that had characterized their marriage before the Montrose ball disrupted its patterns. Sebastian agreed immediately to her conditions, asking only that she tell him honestly if he failed to meet the standard she had set, if his actions proved inconsistent or his transformation proved temporary, promising that he would accept her judgment whatever it might be. And so they stood together in his study as the November afternoon faded into early winter evening and began the slow, uncertain work of rebuilding what had been broken, of attempting to construct something real from the ruins of 5 years of systematic destruction. And Eleanor left the room with her heart still guarded, but her mind cautiously open to the possibility that perhaps, given time and genuine effort, what had been lost might not be entirely beyond recovery. The months that followed their confrontation in Sebastian's study unfolded with a slowness that felt at times like torture and at other times like grace, as winter deepened over Ashford Estate and then gradually yielded to the tentative promises of early spring. And through all those weeks and months, Sebastian maintained his efforts with a consistency that Eleanor found first surprising, then cautiously hopeful, then finally something she began almost against her will to trust, and she watched as he appeared each morning at breakfast, no longer departing before dawn, but instead sitting across from her and asking about her plans for the day, genuinely listening when she described her intentions to visit the tenants or oversee the spring planting or work on the estate accounts, and he began accompanying her on her charitable visits to the village where she saw him interact with people he had previously ignored, saw him learn the names of children and inquire after the health of elderly residents, saw him defer to her knowledge and experience rather than asserting authority he had never bothered to earn. She observed him in those early months with the wariness of someone who had been hurt too deeply to risk quick forgiveness, noting each gesture and weighing it against the years of absence that had preceded this transformation. But as winter turned to spring, and spring edged towards summer, she found herself cataloguing not just his actions, but the subtle shifts in how he looked at her, the way his eyes would seek hers across a room, as though checking whether she was truly there, the manner in which he would pause mid-sentence sometimes, as though struck anew by something she had said, and she began to soften despite her determination to maintain distance, began to feel the walls she had constructed around her heart, developing small cracks through which hope could seep like water, finding its way through stone. There came an evening in late May when they sat together in the library after dinner, a routine that had developed over the months, and Sebastian was telling her a story about a disastrous hunting expedition from his youth, his typical reserve giving way to self-deprecating humor, and Eleanor found herself laughing with genuine delight at his description of falling into a stream while trying to impress his father, and when she looked up still smiling, she saw such wonder in his eyes, such amazement that he had been the cause of her happiness, that she felt something shift irrevocably inside her chest, felt the last of her careful defenses begin to crumble. That night marked a turning point. They both recognized, though neither spoke of it immediately, and in the weeks that followed their conversations deepened, moving beyond the careful exchange of daily details to explorations of thoughts and dreams and fears they had never shared, until finally on a warm June evening, as they walked through the rose garden that Eleanor had lovingly tended for years, Sebastian stopped beside a blooming bush and told her with a vulnerability that made his voice shake that he was falling in love with his own wife, that he was discovering depths and qualities in her that had been there all along, waiting for him to possess the wisdom to see them, and Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes as she confessed that she had never stopped loving him, had merely learned to live with the pain of loving someone who did not return her regard, and when Sebastian reached for her this time, she went willingly into his arms and let herself be held, let herself believe at last that the transformation was real and lasting, and that perhaps from the ruins of 5 wasted years they might build something genuine and true, and their first genuine embrace felt like both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one story and the tentative opening of another, as the scent of roses surrounded them and the late spring evening settled soft and warm over the estate that was finally becoming a home. The transformation of their marriage unfolded over the years that followed with a depth and richness that neither Eleanor nor Sebastian could have imagined possible during those dark months of separation and slow reconciliation, as what had begun as careful reconstruction became genuine partnership, built upon foundations of mutual respect and hard-won understanding, and the Ashford estate that had once echoed with Eleanor's loneliness became filled with the sounds of life and love, with children's laughter ringing through halls that had known only silence, with conversations that lasted deep into the evening hours, with the quiet domestic peace that comes when two people have weathered their worst storms and emerged committed to sailing together through whatever might come. 3 years after that June evening in the Rose Garden, Eleanor stood once more in a ballroom, this time at the Pemberton Estate's annual summer celebration, but the woman who smoothed the silk of her gown and checked her reflection bore little resemblance to the isolated Duchess who had attended the Montrose ball with such trepidation. For this Eleanor moved with confidence born of being genuinely cherished, her eyes bright with happiness that came from being truly seen and valued. And when Sebastian appeared at her side, his hand immediately sought hers with a naturalness that spoke of years of practiced affection, and he looked at her with such obvious pride and love that several nearby guests smiled at the evidence of their devotion. Their children played under the watchful eye of their nurse near the garden entrance, 2-year-old Catherine attempting to catch fireflies while infant Thomas slept peacefully in his carrier, and Eleanor felt Sebastian's hand tighten on hers as they watched their daughter's delighted squeals, both of them silently acknowledging the miracle of this life they had built from the ruins of their beginning. Across the ballroom, Eleanor saw Lord Hartley standing with his wife, Lady Margaret, a spirited woman from Scotland whom he had married the previous year, and when their eyes met, Hartley smiled and raised his glass in salute, for he had become a true friend to both Eleanor and Sebastian, his role in their story acknowledged with gratitude rather than awkwardness, and Eleanor thought with deep appreciation of how his kindness at the Montrose ball had been the catalyst for everything that followed, how his simple act of seeing her and treating her with regard had begun the chain of events that led to this moment. The orchestra began a waltz, and Sebastian turned to Eleanor with a formality that held layers of meaning, offering his hand with a bow that was deeper and more genuine than any court requirement demanded, and Eleanor curtsied in return, the gesture carrying the weight of all the respect and love that had grown between them, the curtsy that had once been offered to another man, now given to her own husband with full consciousness of its significance, and Sebastian's eyes gleamed with emotion as he led her onto the floor, his hand at her waist, steady and sure, and as they moved through the familiar patterns of the dance, Eleanor thought of all the moments that had brought them here, the pain and the healing, the patience and the persistence, the courage it had taken for both of them to be vulnerable enough to try again. Dear listener, this story of Eleanor and Sebastian speaks to truths that extend far beyond the walls of Ashford Estate or the glittering ballrooms of English society, for it reminds us that love is not always a lightning strike of immediate passion, but sometimes a slow cultivation that requires tending through seasons of difficulty, that the greatest transformations often demand we first be broken down to our foundations before we can rebuild on honest ground, and that second chances are possible when both parties possess the courage to acknowledge their failures and the patience to prove their sincerity through sustained action rather than temporary gesture. In your own life, perhaps there are relationships that seem beyond repair, connections that have withered through neglect or been damaged by misunderstanding, and this story offers the gentle encouragement that redemption remains possible if both parties are willing to do the difficult work of genuine change, to move beyond the protective walls we build around our hearts and risk the vulnerability that authentic connection demands, and to understand that healing is measured not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated small gestures of daily regard and consistent presence. May you find the courage to see those you have overlooked, to offer and accept second chances when they are genuinely earned, and to build relationships on foundations of true partnership rather than convenient arrangement. And may you rest tonight with the peace that comes from knowing that love, when tended with patience and watered with genuine effort, can bloom even in the hardest soil and transform the barren landscapes of our lives into gardens of unexpected beauty. This story comes to you from Love and Deepness, where we believe in the power of transformation, the possibility of redemption, and the enduring truth that it is never too late to begin again. And if this tale has touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that patient love can heal even the deepest wounds. And may you sleep well beneath whatever stars shine over your corner of the world, knowing that tomorrow offers another opportunity to choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over protection, and love over fear.